The day my marriage ended, I was folding his shirts. It was a mundane act of domesticity, the kind I'd performed 1,000 times before, my hands moving with the muscle memory of a devoted wife. The cotton was warm from the dryer, scented with the lavender detergent he'd always loved, and I remember thinking how absurd it was that I was standing there, performing this small act of care for a man who had already in his heart left me. The phone was on the kitchen counter, its screen dark and silent, but it might as well have been screaming. I knew what it contained. I had known for weeks in that quiet, insidious way that women know when the man they love is slipping away. It wasn't a single, dramatic discovery, it was 1,000 tiny clues. The way his eyes darted away when he answered a call, the sudden, defensive secrecy around his phone, the way he'd invented late meetings and sudden business trips. But the truth, when it finally came, was still a knife to the chest. His name was Daniel, and I had loved him with a ferocity that now felt like a spectacular act of self-deception. We'd met 5 years ago at a crowded art gallery opening where I'd been volunteering. He was a successful architect, confident and charming, with a smile that could disarm a room. I was a graphic designer, building a freelance career from the ground up, and I fell for him like a stone into deep water. He was recently divorced. He told me his marriage to his high school sweetheart, a woman named Alina, having ended amicably a year prior. "We just grew apart," he'd said with a sad, philosophical shrug. "It happens, we wanted different things." I believed him, I wanted to believe him. I saw his woundedness as a vulnerability, a testament to his capacity for deep feeling. I thought I could heal him, that my love could fill the spaces she'd left empty. We married 2 years later in a small, perfect ceremony by the ocean. I thought I had finally found my forever. I thought the ghosts of his past had been laid to rest. But Alina was never a ghost. She was a living, breathing presence, a spectre that haunted the periphery of our marriage, always waiting for her moment to return. Daniel's phone was always a source of low-level anxiety. He'd never been secretive about his past, and in the beginning he'd even spoken of Alina with a kind of detached fondness, which I'd mistaken for closure. They shared a history, a network of friends, a decade of intertwined memories. I was the new wife, the interloper, and no matter how much I tried to build a new history with him, I could never quite compete with the weight of their shared past. It started subtly, as these things always do. A text message that came in late at night, a small smile playing on his lips as he read it. "Just Alina," he'd say, dismissing it with a wave. "She's having some trouble with the house, wanted my advice." Then it was phone calls, long ones where he'd step into the other room, his voice low and conspiratorial. I'd ask him about it, trying to keep my voice light, non-accusatory. "She's just going through a rough patch," he'd explain with a sigh of exasperation. "Her new boyfriend is a jerk. She doesn't have anyone else to talk to." I wanted to be the understanding wife, the secure, confident woman who didn't feel threatened by a mere ex-wife, but I was neither secure nor confident. I was slowly, painfully being erased from my own marriage, replaced by a memory that was more real to him than I was. The breaking point was a business trip, or so he claimed. "A conference in Chicago," he'd said, packing his suitcase with a brisk efficiency that felt rehearsed. 3 days. "I'll be back Friday night." I made him his favorite meal the night before he left, a silly, desperate act of love, hopping to anchor him to me before he flew away. He was distracted, his answers monosyllabic, his eyes already elsewhere. I watched him leave the next morning, his kiss on my cheek a distant, perfunctory thing, and I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. I didn't snoop, not right away. I tried to be the trusting wife. I busied myself with work, with cleaning, with the endless, mind-numbing tasks that fill the hours when your heart is waiting by the door. But on the second day, the silence in the house became unbearable. I found myself in his study, a room I rarely entered, a space that felt more like his sanctuary than a shared home. His laptop was there, closed, on his desk. I knew the password. It was the date we'd met. In a moment of weakness, driven by a need for certainty that outweighed any sense of propriety, I opened it. His email was open. And there it was, a thread of correspondence with Alina that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just friendly. It wasn't just supportive, it was a love letter, a confession. He was in Chicago, but not for a conference. He was there with her. She had moved there a few months prior, and he'd been visiting her regularly, telling her he was leaving me, that he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd never stopped loving her. The emails spanned months. He was planning to divorce me. He was just waiting for the right time. He was afraid of the confrontation, of the hurt he'd cause me. But his heart, he wrote, was with her. It had always been with her. I was just a placeholder, a warm body, a salve for his loneliness until she came back to him. I read every single word, I memorized them. The betrayal wasn't just in the infidelity, it was in the cruelty of his protracted deception. He'd let me believe I was building a life with him while he was silently, methodically dismantling it. I felt a physical sickness wash over me. My marriage, my home, my future, it was all a lie. I was an unwitting character in his romantic tragedy, the obstacle to be removed so he could reunite with his true love. When he returned from Chicago, I was waiting for him in the living room. I'd printed out the emails. I'd taken a photo of his flight itinerary, which showed he'd flown to Chicago, not for a conference but just to see her. I'd also, in a fit of grim determination, found the number for a hotel in Chicago and pretended to be his assistant, confirming his reservation. The front desk clerk had cheerfully informed me that yes, Mr. Daniel Ashford had a suite booked for the weekend, and yes, his guest, a Ms. Elena Vance, had already checked in. I had it all, every damning piece of evidence. He walked in, all smiles, a cheap souvenir in his hand. "Hi, honey," he said, leaning in to kiss me. I flinched back, his smile faltered. "What's wrong?" I held up the stack of emails. "How was Chicago?" I asked, my voice a monotone. "Did the conference go well? Did you and Elena get a chance to see the sights?" The colour drained from his face. The mask of the loving, slightly exhausted husband fell away, replaced by the panicked expression of a man caught in a trap. "Lily, it's not what you think," he stammered. "The oldest, most pathetic lie in the book." "Oh, I think it's exactly what I think," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I've been reading your love letters. I called the hotel. I know you were with her. I know you're planning to leave me. You just didn't have the courage to tell me to my face." He crumbled. He fell to his knees, a gesture that was supposed to be pathetic and moving but just looked ridiculous. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I was weak. I was confused. I never meant to hurt you." "Confused." I repeated, the word tasting like ash. "You weren't confused, Daniel. You were calculating. You were a coward. You spent months lying to me, pretending to be my husband while you were planning your escape. You didn't just cheat on me. You deceived me. You made a fool of me." He reached for my hand and I pulled away. "Please, Lily, I love you. I do. It's just Elena and I have a history. We have so much history." I thought I was over her, but when she came back into my life, I was weak. "But I want to fix this. I want to make it right. We can go to counseling. We can work through this. I'll never see her again. I swear it." I looked at the man I'd married, the man I'd given my heart to, and I felt nothing but a profound, liberating disgust. "You want to fix this?" I asked, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "There's nothing to fix. You broke it. You chose her. You chose her the moment you got on that plane. You made your choice, Daniel. Now you have to live with it." He begged, he pleaded. He threw out every cliché in the book. He told me I was his soulmate, that he'd made a terrible mistake, that I was the best thing that had ever happened to him. But the words were hollow. They were the words of a man who was terrified of the consequences of his actions, not a man who was truly repentant. He wasn't sorry he'd done it. He was sorry he'd been caught. He'd had his fun, his romantic escape with his ex, and now he wanted to come back to the safety and comfort of his home, his wife, his life. But I wasn't a safety net. I wasn't a consolation prize. I was a woman with a shattered heart, but I still had my dignity. I told him to leave. I told him to pack a bag and go stay with a friend or go to Chicago and be with his precious Elena. I didn't care. I just couldn't bear to look at him anymore. He finally left, his face etched with a dramatic mixture of sorrow and self-pity. He was the hero of his own story, the tortured soul torn between two loves. I was just the collateral damage. The weeks that followed were a blur of tears and paperwork. I filed for divorce. I started packing up our shared life, separating our belongings, dividing the memories. Friends reached out, but I pushed them away. I couldn't bear their pity. I was consumed by a cold fury, a desire for him to suffer as I was suffering. I had the power to hurt him. I could have taken him for everything, dragged his name through the mud. But I didn't. I wanted to be the bigger person. I wanted to move on with my head held high. I thought that was the path to healing, but the anger didn't go away. It festered. I found myself obsessing over Elena. Who was this woman who could inspire such devotion, such reckless, destructive love? I stalked her on social media, finding photos of her laughing with Daniel, their arms around each other, looking so blissfully happy. They were back together, of course. I saw them at a restaurant one night, their heads bent together, sharing a joke. My heart, which I thought had turned to stone, felt a fresh stab of pain. He'd chosen her. He'd thrown away our entire life for a ghost, and he was happy. He was free. And I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered existence. I sank into a deep depression. I stopped going to work. I stopped answering my phone. I lay in bed for days, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our marriage, looking for the signs I'd missed. I blamed myself. I wasn't enough. I wasn't exciting enough, beautiful enough, or interesting enough. I was the stable, boring wife, and she was the passionate, complicated ex. I felt my identity dissolve, swallowed by the black hole of his betrayal. It was during one of those dark days, in a moment of pure, unfiltered desperation, that I found the phone number. I was cleaning out a drawer in my desk, throwing away old receipts and forgotten notes when I came across a business card. It was from a private investigator. I'd gotten it years ago from a client who'd gone through a messy divorce. I'd kept it on a whim, never thinking I'd actually need it. But now I stared at the name and number. I don't know what possessed me. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't even a coherent thought. It was just a raw, primal urge. I wanted answers. I wanted to know what I was up against. I wanted to know who this woman was. I called the number. A gruff voice answered. Vance Investigations. I hesitated, my heart pounding. I need you to find out everything you can about a woman, I said, my voice trembling. Her name is Elena Vance. She lives in Chicago. I want to know everything. Her background, her history, her secrets. Investigator was professional, efficient, and discreet. I paid him a retainer, draining a chunk of my savings, but I didn't care. It felt like an investment in my own sanity. He promised to have a report for me within a week. I spent that week in a state of feverish anticipation, a strange mix of dread and hope. Part of me was terrified of what he'd find. What if she was perfect? What if she was everything he'd ever wanted? What if the reports confirmed my worst fears, that I was indeed the lesser woman? The report arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, the manila envelope feeling heavy in my hands. I opened it with trembling fingers, bracing myself for the blow. The investigator had been thorough. He had a timeline of her life, where she grew up, where she went to school, her career history. There were details about her relationship with Daniel, the high school sweetheart story, their marriage, their divorce. It was all stuff I already knew. But then, towards the back of the report, I found it, the smoking gun, the truth that would change everything. It started with the divorce. According to the investigator's sources, Daniel hadn't been the one to leave Elena. She had left him. She'd been having an affair with a colleague, a man named Marcus, and she'd left Daniel to be with him. Daniel had been devastated. He'd begged her to stay, but she'd walked out without a backward glance. The divorce had been messy, and Daniel had been the one who'd been hurt, the one who'd been left behind. That was the history he'd never told me. He'd created a narrative where he was the one who'd left amicably, where the relationship had just fizzled out. But it was a lie. He had been the rejected one, the one who was left behind. The report went further. Elena's relationship with Marcus had fallen apart a year before she'd started contacting Daniel again. She'd been unhappy, she'd been lonely, and she'd reached out to her ex-husband for comfort. And Daniel, the fool, had been so pathetically grateful for the attention, so eager to be chosen by the woman who had once rejected him, that he'd fallen right back into her web. He was a dog returning to his vomit. He was so blinded by his desperate need for validation that he couldn't see the truth. Elena didn't love him. She was using him. She was using him for validation, for a place to stay, for an ego boost, but there was more. The investigator had also uncovered a series of financial transactions that painted a disturbing picture. Elena had been struggling for money. She'd been evicted from her apartment in Chicago. She had outstanding debts. And just days before she'd reconnected with Daniel, she'd been looking at his social media, seeing the photos of our life, our nice house, our comfortable lifestyle. She was a predator, and she'd targeted him as her prey. She saw a vulnerable, successful man who was still desperately in love with her, and she'd played him like a fiddle. She didn't want Daniel. She wanted what Daniel had. I sat there for a long time, staring at the report. The tears I'd been holding back for weeks finally came, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of catharsis. It wasn't me. It wasn't my fault. I wasn't the one who was lacking. Daniel was a fool. He was a pathetic man who had been manipulated by a predatory woman, and he had been so wrapped up in his own drama that he couldn't see the truth. He'd betrayed me for a lie. The realization was like a switch being flipped in my brain. My grief and self-pity vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating anger. He had chosen her. He had thrown me away for a woman who didn't love him, who was using him for his money. And now he was going to find out. He was going to learn the truth, and it was going to destroy him. But I wasn't going to tell him, not directly. That would be too kind. He needed to discover it for himself. He needed to feel the sting of his own stupidity, and I was going to help him get there. My phone call, the one that changed everything, wasn't to a lawyer or a friend. It was a call to fate itself, a carefully laid trap. I spent the next few days making quiet, strategic moves. I called a few mutual friends. I mentioned in passing that I'd heard Elena was having money trouble. I expressed my concern for Daniel, hoping he wasn't being taken advantage of. I knew the gossip would spread. It always did. I also made sure to leave the investigator's report with certain pages marked, in a place where Daniel would find it when he inevitably came to collect the last of his belongings. He came a week later. I was in the living room pretending to read a book, my heart pounding in my chest. He looked tired, haggard. He'd lost weight. The glow of his new romance was already starting to fade. He mumbled a hello and started gathering his things. He went into his study and I heard him opening drawers. A few minutes later he came out, the report in his hand. His face was ashen. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice shaking. I looked up at him, my expression carefully neutral. "What does it look like?" He was visibly shaking. "It's a lie, it's all a lie. Elena wouldn't do that, she loves me." I stood up and walked towards him. "Does she, Daniel, does she really, or does she just love the idea of you? The successful architect, the nice house, the comfortable life you can give her. She left you once, remember, for another man, and now, when she's broke and desperate, she comes crawling back, and you're so pathetic that you believe her." I looked him dead in the eye. "I didn't tell you this to hurt you, I'm telling you because you need to know the truth. You made a choice, you chose a fantasy, now you get to live with the reality." He stood there, frozen, the report clutched in his hands. I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was replaying every conversation, every text, every moment with her. He was seeing the cracks in her story, the inconsistencies. He was finally starting to wake up. I didn't say anything else. I just walked away, leaving him standing there with the ruins of his beautiful illusion. I knew it wouldn't be long before he called her, before he confronted her. And I knew with a cold certainty that he would find exactly what I'd shown him. She would deny it, of course. She would cry, she would lie, she would try to spin it. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. And they would grow. The trust that had been so naive, so blind, was gone. I walked to my own room and closed the door. I sat on the bed, my hands no longer trembling. I felt an immense weight lift from my shoulders. I wasn't waiting for him to come back. I wasn't hopping for a reconciliation. I was done. I had given him the truth, and it was up to him to do with it what he would. I had finally, truly let go. The phone call that changed everything was a call to myself. It was a call to wake up, to see the situation for what it was, and to reclaim my power. It wasn't a magic spell or a divine intervention. It was me choosing myself. I chose to stop being a victim. I chose to see Daniel for who he truly was, a broken, flawed man who made a terrible mistake. And I chose to walk away from his mess, to stop letting his choices define my worth. The karma wasn't a bolt of lightning. It was the natural consequence of his own delusions, laid bare by the simple truth. He had chosen his ex over me. And now, he would live with the consequences of that choice, knowing the woman he'd chosen had never truly wanted him in the first place. I found my peace in that perfect, terrible knowledge.